Welcome back to Top of Mind on BYU Radio. I'm Julie Rose. Horseshoe crabs have been on the Earth for more than 400 million years. They survived the Ice Age, and they survived whatever it was that wiped out the dinosaurs, but they may not survive us, even though we owe a debt to these gnarly-looking crabs for our own survival. John Tanacredi is the director of the Center for Environmental Research and Coastal Oceans Monitoring at Molloy College in New York, where he's also a professor of Earth and Environmental Studies. He is on the line now. He's an expert on the horseshoe crab. Professor Tanacredi, thank you so much for your time today.
Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for having me.
Describe what a horseshoe crab looks like in case somebody hasn't actually had the privilege of seeing one up close.
Well, you go back to their historic names, helmet crabs. They look similar to maybe the big toe of a horse, and kind of that's historically kind of combined together to get their names. These crabs, actually, they're not crabs. They're not crustaceans. They have their own family, and they're called chelicerates. These are related to, in geological times, they're related to trilobites and arthropods, which are basically insects, and the spiders and scorpions are their close cousins. But they have a historic connection to the coastline, certainly in the United States, and they're only found on the east sides of continents, which is another little tidbit about their distribution, and it has something to do with that paleohistory you mentioned. They were used to bail out canoes by Indians. Their tails or their telson was used at the end of a tree limb as a spear to hunt fish. So they have a practical use, and for many, many years in their history on the East Coast, they were ground up and used as fertilizer. So before petroleum fertilizers were created.
Are they about the size of a dinner plate? How big are the typical horseshoe crabs?
When they're sexually mature, it takes a bit of a time to get to that point. But most of when people see trilobites, they think of them as the tiny little trilobite larvae, which look just like the larger animal, but much, much smaller, obviously. And yes, though there have been some records of horseshoe crabs being almost 2.5 feet across what is called the prosoma, across the main part of their exoskeleton. And being invertebrates, they molt, so many people collect their molts, and in the fossil record, most of the fossils were molting of horseshoe crabs.
Now, what do we know, Professor Tanacredi, about the horseshoe crab's survival capabilities, what it is that has helped them to survive so many millennia?
Well, if I had that real answer, if I actually could get the answer to that, it's kind of a combination of things. I'd probably win the Nobel Prize. But I can tell you that they are paleo survivors. They've survived 5 mass extinction events. They've been projected to the earliest, what they call paleolimuli, which are the fossils, were about 445 million years, and they were predominant along with the most predominant organism in the earliest parts of the Cambrian, up to 500 and 520 million years ago, which were the trilobites. And in New York State, for example, we have a state fossil called Eurypterids. They look like scorpions, and they're related to horseshoe crabs as well. But those, to be able to crawl below the feet of brontosauruses in Earth history is amazing enough. They've survived 5 mass extinction events, which have basically have different causative factors. The most recent, 65 million years ago, a meteorite. But their design, their physiology is very simple, very basic, and
are they just really resilient? I mean, does nothing prey on them that would why would they survive? The dinosaurs and the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs.
Yeah, we can really learn something from them. I mean, first, their what is called fecundity, their ability to produce offspring. A single female, for example, will produce between 80 and 120,000 eggs in a season. So when I get this question asked quite a bit, most people who work with horseshoe crabs get this question: how many horseshoe crabs are there, for example, in the Atlantic coast? And we say, well, somewhere between 4 and 12 million, which means we really don't know. The amazing thing about these animals is that it piques people's interest and pretty excitement. I have a Nat Geo Wild show that was aired called Alien Crabs, and when people start to see either dinosaurs or horseshoe crabs, they have, again, the same kind of inquiry, which is, how are they doing? What's going on with them? I remember them when I was a kid, and they used to coat the beaches all up and down the coastline. And so what's happening to them? There's a kind of a multiplicity of reasons.
That they're declining. We think they're on the decline, but we're not entirely sure.
Well, their range is from Maine to Florida and the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula on the East Coast. This is Limulus polyphemus. This is a North American horseshoe crab. And in their extreme ranges in north and south, they have been dwindling, or the numbers have been declining. We've seen in our work, which is spanning about 16 years, about a 1% decline per year in the total number, but numbers are not really always the answer when it comes down to conservation and conservation ecology for any particular species. The real critical crux of this, I believe, and many people will say the same, scientists will say the same, is the habitat. And we're losing habitat, coastal habitat.
What do they need? What kind of a habitat do they need, and why do they? What exactly is important about the coastline for them?
Well, things that they need access onto the beaches. As the females come ashore in the summer months, starting in late May, they come ashore at high tide and full moon and new moons, and so that there's some kind of trigger that gets them to migrate onto the shoreline. And if there's a rock jetty or some kind of obstruction or a new condominium that goes in along the coastline, or highway, anything that eliminates this sandy, mud-flat beaches that is their primary habitat, then that is dwindling. We're seeing that even in the other species. There's only 4 species of horseshoe crabs on Earth, and 3 of them are in Asia, 1, and again, Limulus is in North America. People will say, is there a pollution problem? Most of the work that's been done, unless it's extremely high concentration, say an oil spill or some kind of toxic emission, but generally they're pretty resilient, and that tells us something about them.
Okay.
The other part of this is that they have been for many years, as I mentioned, they were used for fertilizer, but they now one of their primary gathering or threats is the idea of using them for bait. And it's kind of a niche fisheries. They do conch and eel, which is basically not necessarily consumed in the United States or in maybe Asian communities, but most of that conch and eel is shipped to Asia. And so in New York State, for example, 150,000 horseshoe crabs will be harvested under permit and then basically chopped up and used as bait. The other aspect of this, though this is not a serious threat, but it is something that sort of disrupts their overall ecology along the coastline, is that they are harvested for a very practical and important reason for human health, and that is their blood. They're true blue bloods. They're copper-based bloods, not iron-based like ours, and they produce their amoebocytes, or basically they're very good at detecting endotoxins, or basically gram-negative bacteria, which are the first and most important problem associated with hospital care, injectable drugs, or surgeries, because gram-negative bacteria in your circulatory system or respiratory system produces sepsis, and sepsis is basically a death sentence. So we need something to detect these endotoxins, and LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate, comes from the blood of horseshoe crabs. 600,000 animals of blood each year to produce a $300 million industry around the world. And every hospital, every pharmaceutical, every vitamin, these are tested. The LAL is approved by the FDA. And they have to harvest crabs in order to do this.
Well, hang on. Let me just make sure I understood what you said there, Dr. Tanacredi. So you're saying that there's this special kind of immune cell, an amoebocyte, which is only found, so far as we can tell, in the blood of horseshoe crabs. And so there are pharmaceutical companies that capture and bleed out these horseshoe crabs in order to get their blood, so we can isolate these special immune cells, so that then that is used by hospitals and by drug companies to test for contamination in pretty much anything we ingest, whether it's or surgical tools or vaccines or vitamins. All of that is being. We know it's safe because they've used horseshoe crab blood to test it.
Absolutely right. You're right that you're officially a crab person now. You have exactly the concern at this point. There is no synthetic. There are some synthetic type endotoxin detecting compounds that the pharmaceutical industries have produced. They just can't get it past the FDA, and so that one, I kind of call it the multiple levels of protection for these animals. And I'll tell you a little bit about on an international scale. If there can be a synthetic detecting system, it can save the animals from having to be harvested. Now they're like you give blood and I give blood. It's a similar circumstance. Put the animals back. They do not take all of them. They don't bleed them out. But in some places,
so they don't actually kill the horseshoe crabs when they take their blood for the medical uses.
No, and the numbers vary, depends on who you talk to, between 1% and 20%. Some I've seen in the literature, but that is kind of symptomatic of what is kind of is happening, and it's really horseshoe crabs are sort of a silent siren when it comes down to this particular problem, because only in the last and we've experienced this because there was a history of understanding. There's always been research on horseshoe crabs, but starting in 2005, we were planning a group of scientists here in New York and in the Northeast and in Asia, talking to the first international conference on horseshoe crabs, which was done in 2007, and our first publication in 2009, talking about 45 papers from some 12 countries that are looking at horseshoe crab work. The idea that if they could come up with a synthetic to replace that, it would save them some of these animals. But what's happening in parts of the world where economics is driving, Singapore, for example, in Singapore, a different species, but a horseshoe crab, again, there's only 4 species, as I mentioned, is harvested at a rate during the breeding season of 10,000 animals a day. Those animals are bled out totally. The blood is sent to a Chinese company to produce a similar LAL endotoxin compound, and the animals are then scooped out and used as an exotic food. And we've seen this has become even more and more of a concern because if at that rate the numbers it'll be decimating the entire population, and the 3 populations of horseshoe crabs in Asia, which are found off Japan, the coast of China. Hong Kong has a big reintroduction program, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Singapore, but Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and the Bay of Bengal off of India. And in all those cases, we don't even know how many animals there are. We don't even know all of the habitat might be available. The Philippines, for example, have 7,000 islands, and we haven't investigated any of them. So a host of problems associated with the demand for exotic food, the demand for a synthetic made from their blood, the reduction in habitat in all of these countries, more and more. 2/3 of the entire human population live near the coastline, and coastal habitat is in competition constantly with with horseshoe crabs.
It's really a multi-pronged problem then. There are lots of different, and I imagine even warming ocean waters may also be affecting their behavior. So we're going to have to kind of tackle, if we want to make, and of course losing the horseshoe crab means we lose this really important this bacterial identifier that we all need for our health. So we need the horseshoe crabs to succeed and to thrive so we can continue to use their blood.
I agree, and I can tell you it has other practical factors as well. I mean, the space shuttle program has ended, but during the space shuttle program, when satellites were prepared to go into the space shuttle and then to be blasted off to space, NASA would use LAL to detect any kind of contamination in the gold rooms, because all of the satellites were coated with sheets of gold, and they had to make sure there was no contamination even there. So, and there's been some cancer research attempts. There's a host of things that have been looking at the horseshoe crabs. I mean, the horseshoe crabs, a Nobel Prize was won for studying horseshoe crabs, their eyes, their physiology. Their blood has been intensively investigated for quite some time. And so as much as we know about them, that's as little as we know about them. So there's quite a bit of attention. Yeah,
we're just about out of time, but can you tell me if it's possible, is anybody trying to breed these horseshoe crabs in captivity? I mean, is that a possible avenue to save their populations?
Well, there's only two breeding laboratories in the world. One is at Hong Kong University, City University of Hong Kong, and the other is at Molloy College at CIRCOM. The difficulty is that they are invertebrates, therefore they molt when they grow. They don't become sexually mature between 9 and 12 years because the males and females molt at a different rate. So we have a few animals that are 8 to 8 years old, 7 to 8 years old in our laboratory, but it's very, very difficult. This could never be a mass breeding program. The best way to protect these animals is to not have them used for bait, not being able to bleed them and have a synthetic, protect their habitat, and to maybe restore some of the habitat for them for breeding purposes. And the animals have been around for quite some time. It would be a sad testimony to us to force this animal into extinction. And I think at the rate that they're being consumed at this point, and without knowing everything about them, it may be very much a fait accompli.
John Tanacredi is director of CIRCOM, the Center for Environmental Research and Coastal Oceans Monitoring at Molloy College in New York. He's also a professor of Earth and Environmental Studies. Thank you very much for sharing your insight today on the horseshoe crabs. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie, for having me.
This is Top of Mind on BYU Radio.